Hey everyone, Raptor Chatter here, and we're going to be looking at what happened in March 2023 in paleontology. And sorry for this getting out late, there's been a lot going on. But here we go. Dinosaurs were odd, and that's being polite about it. Compared to just about every other dinosaur group, their anatomy is incredibly strange, with very long claws, in the case of Therizinosaurus, up to a meter long or almost 3 feet, and seemingly they were herbivorous theropods. And that's the group more normally associated with meat-eating dinosaurs. And there's a few throughout it that actually did pivot towards herbivory, and the Therizinosaurs are just maybe the strangest of them. This paper was an attempt just to describe one of their anatomies, and that's from Nothronychus, one of the larger Therizinosaurs. Here's me for scale and a photo with one. The paper is largely trying to look at its hip structures to try and understand how it would have walked. There's basically two ideas: that it would have been more traditionally theropod-like with a more flat back, and that it could have been more bird-like with a more upright back. And without getting too far into it, this is probably suggesting a more bird-like walking structure, and this is just describing some of the bones. That said, I've seen work done at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology conference and at the Western Association of Vertebrate Paleontology, which shows that these authors are working to do more with this animal so they can really understand how it would have moved. As for other things we've heard about before, there's a lot of stuff that Jim Kirkland's been talking about in order to refine what is happening in the biostratigraphy of terrestrial vertebrates in Utah. Essentially, which dinosaurs and other animals lived when. And that's what this paper finally is. It's that description of what dinosaurs lived when in Utah. And Utah is a really good sequence of rocks to be able to understand what was happening in the Cretaceous and even large parts of the late Jurassic. So really useful, and hopefully we'll be able to use this and apply this kind of as a metric other places. One time period that doesn't have a lot of great rocks for understanding what was happening in the world, though, is the Middle Jurassic. And this time they looked at microfossils coming from the Middle Jurassic of the UK. And that means they essentially took a bunch of sediment, screen washed it, and went, hey look, there's little teeth in here. And they found 6 different morphotypes of dinosaur teeth. There's a vague Ornithischian one, which there's no real group to assign it to, but it's definitely an Ornithischian. But there's also a stegosaur and an ankylosaur, which these don't normally overlap at the same times. Additionally, there's 2 other vague Thyreophorans, which is the group that includes the stegosaurs and the ankylosaurs, their ancestral relatives. And the final tooth fossil is from a heterodontosaurid, which may actually be the group that led to the marginocephalians, which includes pachycephalosaurs and ceratopsians. It's hard to know for sure though, we don't have a lot of great fossils for them in the Middle Jurassic. Still though, this helps to highlight the diversity of Ornithischians that were occurring in Europe during the Middle Jurassic, and hopefully at some point we'll get some better fossils of them and we can really understand what they were like. As for adding to some of that Ornithischian diversity, there's a new fossil coming from the late Jurassic of Portugal, and it's also an Ornithischian and an early branching iguanodontian. Hesperonyx martenhodomosaurum is the new one, and it would have been somewhat small, maybe up to 4 meters in length or a bit over 12 feet. It's not super complete, which makes it a little hard to place down, but it's either on the line towards things like Iguanodon or potentially closely related to the Dryosaurs, which is this weird group of early branching, early iguanodontians that we have some very questionable ideas about. Unfortunately, a lot of them come from the southern hemisphere and are very partial, so we just don't have a lot of material to really look at them with. Regardless, this still adds to the diversity of what was happening in the late Jurassic of Europe, which at the time would have been an archipelago with lots of small islands, and potentially that led to some of the small sizes we see in animals like Hesperonyx. Trachelosaurus is very relevant to the suggestion of very early branching iguanodontians or Ornithischians, and specifically ornithopods. And that's because it would have been an elasmarian. The elasmarians are probably a valid group of largely southern ornithopods. And they're interesting, but again, largely partial and just hard to understand. Fortunately though, Trachelosaurus is actually known from multiple specimens from juvenile to adult. So with any further work, we'll actually be able to understand what was happening with these organisms. Additionally though, based on the shape of its humerus being different from some other similarly sized ones, again, not very big, it does suggest that it was potentially moving in a different manner. Now we'll have to do more research to see if that meant it was quadrupedal or bipedal, and what that also means for all of the other elasmarians, like Lianosaura coming from Australia, but still very interesting for showing their broader diversity and hopefully in the future giving us our one really good look into what these organisms might have been like. Staying in South America, but jumping from Argentina to Uruguay, there's also the first named dinosaur coming from Uruguay. Udellertitan celeste is the first named dinosaur from Uruguay, and it is actually a titanosaur sauropod. This is really interesting because compared to a lot of the other titanosaurs, it was fairly small. You can just see how small in this comparison of it compared to a human, and this comparison of Argentinosaurus compared to a human. Massive differences in its size, and it seems like it was basically an adult. This really helps to highlight the diversity that titanosaurs had in South America during the early Cretaceous, and how they carried some of that diversity into the later parts of the Cretaceous. Jumping back into Argentina and into the latest Cretaceous, there's also the largest known mammal coming from the Mesozoic. So essentially the age of dinosaurs. It's been named Patagomaya, and it probably would have weighed around 30 pounds, which is on the same scale as a coyote today. Coyotes, for those who don't know, are kind of like jackals. They're dogs that hunt in mostly open grasslands, and they're not the largest predators on the environment, but they do exist. This would also make it larger than other animals that would have lived during the Cretaceous that were also mammals and did get to at least moderate sizes, potentially even preying on small dinosaurs, such as Repenomamus coming from parts of China, and also Adalatherium coming from Madagascar. This helps to show the growing diversity of mammal groups during the latest part of the Cretaceous, and how, while still being relatively small, they would have been better suited to survive the KPG extinction. That would have helped them to also then start diversifying into larger forms, and especially larger predators, as most of the ones that we do know of don't seem to have been that herbivorous. On the subject of Patagomaya, or Patagonia mother, Maya being mother, we can also look at how a certain study was able to CT scan the brain cases of different early mammal relatives and see how different traits may have actually been able to lead to their successes, including parenting. Now, the study also used a lot of neurological studies that I'm not super familiar with, but the main thing that they found is actually it's probably inherited from their amniote ancestor. The amniotes being everything that leads to reptiles and mammals. And so there's a lot of diversity in that group, but very, very importantly, the thing that we need to understand here is mammals and reptiles both do parental care. And that might seem strange because mammals are so heavily invested in it, but reptiles still do. Obviously, with crocodilians, they tend to protect their young. Turtles are a bit of an outlier, but they still at least lay nice nests to protect their young as much as they can. But even things like rattlesnakes will still stay with their young until they're first shed. So we do see parental care most of the way throughout all of amniotes. What this means in a neurological brain sense, the preconditions for potentially taking care of young more were already set before the first mammals. And then just progressively as they evolved things like milk, it became more reliant on parental care for the young. And that's how mammals became what they are today. But there's also a study looking at those brain cases more just to understand the general phylogenies of different groups, and they were able to do a decent amount with this, including being able to identify certain groups that have been somewhat unsupported by other studies, including things such as the Gallosaurids, which haven't come out nicely in some other studies. I'm not super great at all of the brain stuff, but I will essentially surmise that, yeah, they were able to go, hey, all of these brain features that we see in mammals, we can kind of see them showing up in different Cynodont groups. Cynodonts being the stem mammals, so not quite a mammal, but very, very close. And so we can see this kind of slow progression of evolution for the brain in mammals. And from things as simple as how brains might have influenced parental care to the deaths of certain animals. Specifically, large ones that die in the sea. These are called deadfalls, and most famously, there's whales that sink to the bottom and support all kinds of different life. These researchers were able to find some coming from Italy in the Jurassic. What they found is a few different time intervals on essentially what was happening to the carcass as it decayed. The first one being the most obvious, things like sharks and seagoing crocodilians were eating parts of the carcass, but also ammonites were. And based on what this study found is some of those ammonites were actually feeding at depth, which is some of the first solid evidence we've had of ammonites actually getting to the deep oceans as opposed to shallow oceans where they're more normally found. But then there are organisms that saw it as a secondary chance at enrichment. And by that I mean essentially when there's the little bits of meat that are left on the bones that can't be pulled off, things like urchins and sea stars and other smaller organisms could come in and feed on that. Additionally, it seems like belemnites, squid-like animals, might have been doing the same thing. And I say that specifically because there's been a few of these fossils with a lot of belemnites around. Many of the modern day cephalopods will breed once and then almost immediately die afterwards, with their eggs just kind of going off. So potentially these belemnites were using these deadfalls as a source of protein for their young larvae when they bred. And then obviously they died, and their little gladiuses, the gladii, I guess, would have stayed around the carcass and been preserved with it. And then finally you have what showed up when it was basically just bone. And what that seems like is crinoids. Crinoids are stalked echinoderms closely related to things like urchins and sea stars, except they had this long stalk that would have helped them extend their arms into the water, and they would have filter fed. What it seems like was happening here is they basically just used the bones as that hard surface that they could attach to. And that's based on the holdfasts that are still preserved on many of these bones. And this would basically be the last stage of the carcass being used. It's somewhere for things like crinoids to hang on to. As for other organisms that need to hang on to things, you have things like the brachiopods. Brachiopods are actually not that closely related to clams despite their superficial appearance. They have different symmetry and have different organs for being able to filter feed. That said, they did live very similar lives. What this paper looked at is essentially how they changed throughout the Jurassic. What they found is there was a lot of diversity around the equator during the Jurassic. However, during the Mesozoics, the oceans underwent massive change. And for the brachiopods, what that means is, towards the end of the Cretaceous, they really weren't that popular around the equator. And that tracks up towards modern day, where brachiopods just aren't nearly as common as they once were. That said, with brachiopods, they really suffered during the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, the worst extinction in Earth's history, where up to 95% of life in the oceans died out. This paper looked at, okay, well, is there anything in common that these different groups had that died out? And what they found is the ability to transport oxygen is probably the main thing. And you can see that in these different groups, including the brachiopods, which did not do very well. Meanwhile, some organisms with more copper-based blood did do reasonably well, and then iron-based blood organisms did the best. So that ability to transport oxygen was very key for this extinction. Sharks also lived before this extinction and did very well after it. However, how exactly they survived has been somewhat of a question. That said, a new fossil coming from Japan may help to answer it. Parvodus omina chinensis is a new species of shark coming from river deposits in Japan. What this means is potentially this stream that it would have been living in during the early Triassic is what allowed them to survive. Essentially, as streams kept getting refreshed by spring water, they were more stable during that extinction interval. That means freshwater sharks, like Parvodus, could have survived there and then migrated elsewhere. I say this because Parvodus has been found both in fresh and saltwater environments. This is just also one of the earliest, if not the earliest, occurrence of one. So again, really seems like they were hanging out in fresh water, at least able to survive there, and then eventually migrated back out to marine sediments and spread later. As for other animals that were moving between different water systems, there were some that were actually moving from land all the way into the water. And that includes Trachelosaurus, which comes from Germany, and it would have been one of the long-necked archosauromorphs like Tanystropheus. This is actually really interesting because it kind of falls in between the times of Tanystropheus and earlier animals that were pretty similar coming from China, like Dinocephalus. For a long time, it wasn't super well understood. It was just kind of a jumble of vertebra and some rib segments, so it's hard to say for sure. Now that we've had so many of these other long-necked archosauromorphs found, that we can look at it and go, yeah, it's very closely related to one of these. So we're getting a better understanding of how these organisms got their start, probably in the South China Sea, and then migrated across Eurasia into parts of Europe, and eventually were able to even cross Pangaea and get into parts of Arizona. And on the subject of some of those, you have things like Tanystropheus coming from some of the wonderful black shale beds of Italy. And you also have things like Mixosaurus, one of the early ichthyosaurs that also comes from these black shale beds. This paper essentially just looked at what the different organisms were in the different layers of this, and we're able to create kind of a sequence on how the oceans would have been, with things like the Tanystrophiids being very common early on, but eventually losing out to things like Mixosaurus. That said, there's more Triassic fossils coming from Europe, and again, in Germany. This time, though, it's Parvosaurus harudensis. And yes, very similar beginning of that name. It's probably from the same location, or at least a very similar location. Parvosaurus would have been a sphinodontan, which sphinodonts are things like the modern-day Tuatara. They're very closely related to lizards, but not technically lizards for a few minor details that occur in things like the arms having certain structures. That said, it really helps to show that lizards already would have diversified from things like Parvosaurus at this time, and it is also the first known Spinodontian coming from Europe. So it's the earliest known one. We know they got there by at least the late Triassic during the Norian stage. There's also still a lot of fossils of things closely related to lizards and Spinodontians coming from Europe though. So that means that was likely the place they got their start, and then they were able to spread throughout different parts of the world, including around the same time as Parvosaurus, certain fossils that have been found in petrified forest. Those aren't published on, but they're at least closely related, so it really helps to suggest that they did evolve in Europe and then spread rapidly. Meanwhile, we have basically no lizard or closely related to lizard fossils coming from South America or even parts of Africa. So again, it seems like lizards really got their start in the north. Turtles are really odd. We had a whole video on them recently, and this is another one that's pretty odd, not because it's super unique or anything, but simply because of its preservation. It's not actually preserved with any bone, instead it's a mold, where essentially the animal died, its plastron, the belly part of its shell, was pressed into the mud, and then the shell disappeared. Or maybe it just sat there for a second and left. It's hard to know for sure. But essentially it's the first turtle fossil like this known. That's the really interesting part. So, whole new method of turtle preservation that we've found just based on this one fossil. And going further back towards that Permian-Triassic extinction event, we also have large Durophagous fish from the early Triassic. Durophagi being when they're eating very hard things like clams or mussels. Unfortunately, the fossil isn't super complete, but we can tell that it would have been an Actinorhabdurigian, which is really interesting. This is ray-finned fish, and before this there were a lot of lobe-finned fish still. These are things more like coelacanths. So this is really starting to show that initial burst of diversity that the ray-finned fish, that are now the most common fish in the world, would have actually had immediately following the Permian-Triassic mass extinction. There's also a paper looking at the tree fern order Cyatheales, and this is a tree order that's actually still around today. You can find members of this group. However, looking at the fossils from both the late Triassic all the way up to the modern day, they went through a lot of changes. The most notable change they found in this paper, though, is essentially where they lived. It was generally thought that they likely evolved in the south, as that's where most of their modern diversity is. However, it seems like actually the opposite is the case, where they evolved in the north, spread to the south, and then most of the ones in the north went extinct. And that's interesting for plenty of other reasons. The paper doesn't really dive into that reasoning specifically, but it helps to show how important it is to bring fossil data into our understanding of modern day groups. There's also a paper looking at how ants may have avoided extinction because of angiosperms. Angiosperms are plants that are different than gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are the more old group of plants. They started much earlier, and they include things like pine trees and cycads today. That said, the angiosperm trees are ones that started developing flower buds and fruit to protect their seeds. What this paper is suggesting is that because of the boom in angiosperms during the late Cretaceous, ants were able to take up a lot of different ecospace, and with that in mind, they were able to survive, especially a lot of the smaller ones as opposed to older ants, like the hell ants, which are so named because they had very unique biting mechanisms. That said, the hell ants did go extinct, and seemingly that's because they weren't as reliant on angiosperm trees, which did pretty well across the KPG extinction. Another paper looked at climate change and extinction, and was able to basically find, hey, animals with much broader tolerances are more likely to survive extinction due to climate change. And you can think about this with two birds that are nearby where I live, the housefinch and the dark-eyed junco. Dark-eyed juncos mostly live in the mountains, and they spread pretty far north, but with climate change they're probably not going to do as well. And that's especially true of populations in southern parts of the US, where it's going to get much warmer and they're probably not going to do well there. Meanwhile, if you have things like housefinches, which are spread almost entirely across the United States, you might have some struggling populations in places like New York when it warms up. However, there's also populations here in Arizona and also parts of Sonora, Mexico. Those ones, when it warms up, are probably going to do pretty well. So those populations might be able to expand over a broader area. That's the important takeaway, is that it's not just the whole group does very well, it's different populations that do well. You can't just take a housefinch from the deserts of Arizona, drop it off in Central Park and be like, yeah, it'll be fine. No, it's going to freeze. And on the subject of extinctions, ferns are generally just treated as, oh yeah, they always do great after extinctions. But how true is that? This paper looked and found that there's only really two extinctions that they did very well after. That's the Permian-Triassic mass extinction and the KPG mass extinction. both two extinctions that are not exactly like the others. One was caused by absolutely rapid runaway global warming, and the other was caused by a massive impact from space. That said, they really hadn't evolved at the time of some of the other mass extinctions because just life on land hadn't developed that far yet, so it's hard to say for sure. And we obviously only have a very limited sample size of 5 mass extinctions. So still, it's very interesting to look at because, hey, maybe it's not always the case that ferns just pop up just totally wantonly everywhere after everything else dies. Seems like the situation might be a little bit more complex than that, and hopefully we'll get a better answer for that in the future. And finally, how far plants have spread might actually be an indicator on how well life will be able to bounce back from mass extinctions, and that includes animal life. I think the best case of this is the Permian-Triassic and the Triassic-Jurassic extinctions in this paper, where you can see during the Permian-Triassic extinction there's really not a lot of plants right by the equator. There's not a massive amount of biodiversity the way you would expect based on the world today. That said, you can also look at the End-Triassic extinction, and during that time period, yeah, it seemed like there was a lot of plant biomass right around the equator, and that plant biomass, while large parts of it still did die off, was able to continue supporting large complex ecosystems, which is probably why we see more of a faunal turnover, where there's things like certain kinds of archosaurs and pseudosuchians that were on land as top predators just kind of die out and get immediately replaced by things like dinosaurs. As for all this extinction talk, it's important to remember that life will bounce back, and that includes what we can see in the fossil record, especially in places like the Eocene London clay coming from the UK, and that's because there's a lot of bird fossils in there that are pretty diverse. The 3 new species all belong to the same genus, Eosipsalis. Meanwhile, there's another fossil described that's a new specimen of Primapus. What they found is that these 2 different genera that were closely related in Odopiformes would have hunted in different ways. Eosipsalis would have likely been flying for longer periods of time, more like a modern-day swift, and catching insects on the wing. That said, Primapus wouldn't have been necessarily a slouch either, not catching insects on the wing. Instead, it was probably more like a kingbird, where it would perch at the top of a tree, hang out for a bit, and then go, oh hey look, there's a bug. Oh hey, there's a bug, and then just keep coming back to the same perch. That could also be things like Sais phoebes that do the same thing. At the same time these birds were showing up to take insects on the wing, there were also bats starting to evolve, and that includes Onychonychus. There's been some debate about Onychonychus and how well it could have flown, and maybe it was only gliding and all of this other kind of ideas about how good it actually could have been in the air. What this paper did is well, it's important to remember not just the places of the continents and the climate changed, but also that means the atmosphere itself changed. And what they were able to do is look at paleoclimate records and go, hey, the atmosphere was probably a little bit denser 50 some odd million years ago. And what that means is Onychonychus would have been very capable of powered flight. That denser atmosphere also helps to indicate how they would have evolved, because those large arms up at the front would not necessarily have made as great of a gliding membrane in our world, but 50 million years ago they did. And that also meant that eventually those large gliding arms could turn into proper wings. Nothronychus is a new species of crocodiloid coming from Spain during the Middle Eocene, and is the westernmost example of the genus. Members of this genus have been found all across Eurasia, and combined with another species coming from Germany, it's very closely related, which means potentially there were different niches and different evolutionary histories to these different groups, with some of the Asian ones being more closely related to one another, and then some of the more European ones being closely related to one another. What this means is that it was likely just one dispersal event from their origination, rather than multiple dispersals at different times. But crocs weren't only in the water, there were also things like the Barusuchids, which most famously come from the Ataminta Basin in Argentina, and there's a lot of them there, including the new one that's being described, which is among the smallest ones known. Now, they didn't actually give it a name, they were just describing it and comparing it to some other small ones, such as Gondwanasuchus. What they found is that neither of those are really adults. So what that likely means is potentially things like Gondwanasuchus shouldn't be considered legitimate genera, and so they should be considered juveniles of larger organisms, in this case Stratiasuchus. Based on the position and size of different jaw muscles, they were able to also suggest that it wasn't necessarily hey, they're going to take super close care of their young. Instead, the young were probably eating things like insects all around the very small parts of the environment. Meanwhile, things like Stratiasuchus could go after larger prey. Barusuchids, like all crocodilians and toothed dinosaurs, would have lost teeth throughout their entire lives. And part of the question then becomes, well, if you just have an isolated tooth without the rest of the skull, can you tell what it came from? And these researchers try to do that with the Kemkem bed in Morocco. They selected 36 different teeth, put them through a scanning electron microscope to image them very well, and basically were able to go, hey look, we can actually kind of tell some things from this. For example, some of them are from a carcharodontosaur, likely Carcharodontosaurus. Some of them are also from an abelisaur, which is nice. Hey look, it's probably an abelisaur. There's also some that are, hey look, this is Spinosaurus. Wonderful, we can do this using all these different morphometrics that are being done in better detail than most other papers have done. There's also one, though, that was a little harder to place, and they actually suggest it could be a Megaraptoran, which normally are known for having very large hand claws and not as heavily built heads as other large theropods. That said, the silhouette they use is also from a Noasaur, which would have been very closely related to the abelisaurs, but they also seem to have potentially become herbivorous, or at least not as carnivorous, or at least hypercarnivorous, targeting large prey. So they may have targeted smaller prey. There's a lot of questions going on with that group. Regardless, there's seemingly a lot of different morphologies on teeth that you can use to tell even animals with very similar teeth apart. And if only there was something that was happening in Arizona with a lot of teeth from the Triassic, a certain YouTube presenter that talks about paleontology might be helping with something like that. Another paper looked at trace marks left on bones from African carnivores. Essentially, how did these African carnivores, which include things like different hyenas, lions, leopards, and the African wild dog, leave different traces on different bones? And they did this mostly using zoo collections. However, importantly, they were able to look at that and go, hey look, we can actually identify who bit what. Hopefully this will help us starting to understand how different trace marks in the fossil record might come from different organisms. Because right now it's kind of just it might be this that made it. Here we go. This is a 3D printed T-Rex skull. But it's not just any T-Rex skull. It's actually Sue the T-Rex. And Sue the T-Rex is one of the most famous specimens of a Tyrannosaurus. The 3D model for Sue the T-Rex was made years ago when the skull was CT scanned at the Field Museum where it's housed. And that seems kind of minor, like, oh nice. But actually that led to a larger project called the Open Vertebrate Project, or OVERT for short. This project was able to get CT scans of almost every single vertebrate group alive today and many fossil ones. You can actually even go onto the database where they have all of this information and scan and look at different models for many different organisms. Specifically, morphosaurus.org being the repository where all this data is housed. Unfortunately, though, they also talk about some of the issues that this project had, such as low quantities of different organisms. For example, you can look at Thamnophis rufipunctatus, the narrow-headed garter snake, which I'm actually in a lab that studies this. And what they looked at was, hey, there's exactly one of those. And that's an issue that occurs in many groups, is you have, sure, a great 3D scan of an organism from that group, but there's only one. You can't really do statistically relevant information from just one organism. They also mentioned that there's a lot of issues with how specimens are housed in museums. Birds and mammals, for example, are taxidermy. You don't necessarily keep all of the internal organs around. I mean, just think about an elephant. If you wanted to keep a wet specimen with all of the internal organs preserved, you would need a giant tub that can fit an elephant and then filling it with formaldehyde or the modern day equivalent. And with the budget most modern natural history museums are dealing with, that's just not gonna happen. It's just the funding isn't there to be able to house a massive specimen like that totally as a wet specimen with liquid helping to preserve it. It's just not practical. That's really unfortunate, and also a lot of those large animals just don't fit into CT scanners, so you can't use a freshly dead one either. I mean, a zoo has an elephant keel over, who are you going to call to get a giant CT machine to actually image it with? Again, not practical, and those are some of the limitations of the project. That said, there have been publications using data from this project, and so hopefully it will lead to better understanding of what was happening in modern day vertebrate anatomy, and also fossil vertebrate anatomy. As for some of those large animals that would be hard to keep, you can also look at whales, because whales are obviously the largest animals potentially ever, especially when you're looking at things like the blue whale. However, a lot of their origination has been hard to nail down. Sure, we have things like Pachycetus for the very early first whales, but when we get closer to modern whales, it's been difficult. And there's been a lot of diversity occurring around New Zealand. This includes some very early mysticetes or baleen whales. And what this paper was able to do is look at those closer and get some good strontium dates for those rocks. What they found is they date back to the early Miocene, making these among the earliest mysticetes anywhere in the world, which means it's very likely that the seas around New Zealand were very important for mysticete evolution. And then eventually they were able to spread north and get throughout the entirety of the world's oceans. But it's not just baleen whales this month. There was also a look at a toothed whale, specifically a dolphin coming from the Amazon basin, and it would have been a freshwater dolphin. Pebenista yacaruna is the new freshwater dolphin, and at over 3 meters, it would have been the largest of the freshwater dolphins. Interestingly, it's also very closely related to a different river dolphin, at least based on its morphology, and that's Planastia from South Asia, meaning it's totally separate from where it would have normally occurred, or at least what we would have thought it would have normally occurred. Instead, we'd have expected it to be much closer related to the Amazonian river dolphin. But instead, it seems like two different dolphin groups actually were able to help call the Amazon basin their home. And they would have likely been doing different things, and unfortunately for this animal, it went extinct. And that's why we're left with only the Amazon river dolphin today. Peltocephalus maturin is a new giant turtle also coming from the Amazon river basin, and it would have been fairly large. At around 7 feet in length, it wouldn't be as large as something like Stupendemus, which is one of the largest, if not the largest turtle known. That said, this animal, based on carbon dating, would have lived only about 11,000 years ago, meaning there's a very real chance that humans in South America would have seen this giant 7-foot-long turtle in the rivers that they would also call their homes. It also doesn't seem to have been particularly closely related to animals like Stupendemus, which means large turtles just kind of show up when the conditions are right and can proliferate very well. So those papers were about animals that moved from land to the water, but we can also look at vertebrates moving from the water to land, and that includes in South Australia. This is really interesting because the oldest tetrapod fossils known come from Nunavut in Canada, specifically Ellesmere Island, so very, very far north. And while sure the continents would have been closer, they weren't necessarily that close together. That said, fossils like Metaxognathus show that very early tetrapods were still present in parts of New South Wales in Australia. This paper, though, wasn't necessarily concerned about how well it could have moved around, but more what the environment was like. And what it found is a very similar environment to what has been suggested at the Devonian sites of Nunavut, which is it would have been a wooded streamland. What that means is that it's likely that many of these early tetrapods came up through streams and then started to evolve to move onto land so that they could hunt or avoid predators better. So this is all really just to say that, yeah, it seems like vertebrates, when they moved to land, were doing it in forested streams. They weren't out in deserts or coming up on the seashore. They were in streams and rivers and moving around on those environments. But of course, some of them became more successful on land, and that includes the amphibamiforms, which might actually be fairly closely related to modern-day amphibians, and there's still a lot of debate about that. That said, the relationship seems pretty likely. Kermitops gratis was named after the green frog from the Muppets. Kermitops. I mean, just Kermit in the Muppets, but Kermitops for this genus name. It would have lived during the early Permian, and this is around the time that genetics say that most modern amphibian groups would have been starting to split from one another. In fact, it may actually be a little bit after that. Unfortunately, it seems like many of them retained amphibamiform characteristics up until the Triassic, where we start seeing things that are definitely frogs, or definitely salamanders, or even definitely Cyatheales, this odd group of burrowing amphibians. That said, Kermitops did have one trait that is similar to what we do see in modern-day amphibians, and that's pediculate teeth, where you have a little bit of enamel at the bottom, less enamel in the middle, and then more enamel at the top. It's very unique to amphibians, and Kermitops had this, so likely it was pretty closely related to the amphibians, and potentially the amphibian common ancestor was an amphibamiform that we just haven't narrowed down as much which one it might have been. Staying in Australia and moving back in time to the Cambrian, there were also some new finds of nautiloids coming from the Cambrian. Cynoemeroceras merriwedae is described in this paper from many specimens, which are all very well preserved. They're so well preserved, in fact, that you can see the 3D anatomy of the siphuncle, this tube that would run through the center of the shell and help with gas exchange in these organisms and also in ammonites. Previously, it had been thought that the very early cephalopods didn't have a lot of complexity to their siphuncle, and that's largely because most of them were preserved in 2D. They were flattened into basically just a sheet. You can't see all the structures if you just flatten it down. That said, these ones are able to show that, no, it's pretty complicated and pretty similar to those found in modern Nautilus. This kind of very complex gas exchange system may have been what helped them to actually colonize and live in parts of the deep sea, which might also be part of the reasons that they're alive today and ammonites aren't. There's also a new fossil of Selkirkia found. It's a worm genus coming from the Cambrian. Except this one's not in the Cambrian, it's in the Ornithischian, which means that this is one of the worms that actually survived from worm world, where worms were very common in the Cambrian, to where they became slightly less common during the Ornithischian and later throughout the rest of the Mesozoic and Paleozoic. The new fossil comes from Morocco, where there's great Ornithischian rocks and they've been explored pretty well. And there's exactly one specimen, so it's not like it was super common or they did super well. But they did at least make it through what happened at the end of the Cambrian, where there was a lot of changes to life. Not necessarily a mass extinction, but just changes, because you have very early life forms and then eventually a few groups start to evolve things that help them become more successful, and the entire ecosystem has to change for that. Staying in Morocco and jumping all the way to the Cretaceous, there's also a new plioplatycarpine mosasaur coming from Morocco. Khinjaria acuta is this new mosasaur, and its skull is very, very unique. It almost looks like what would happen if a kid drew one. It had massive, massive teeth, but also if you look at the rear part of the skull, you can see where certain bones are very elongated and other bones near the front of the skull are kind of shortened. So it had almost a bulldog-like face, where short front, massive muscles on the rear side of it. So it was likely biting hard things, but not with rounded teeth the way you might expect. What this means is it probably was feeding in some way that no other mosasaur that we know of was, and that there was a lot of diversity happening with these lizards of the ocean. Staying in the oceans, but moving back into the Middle Jurassic, we also have a new species of ichthyosaur, meaning that essentially this would have been around before the mosasaurs were even a thing. Argovisaurus martifernandezi is a new ophthalmosaurian. The ophthalmosaurs were a group of very large-eyed, deep-diving ichthyosaurs, most famously categorized by Ophthalmosaurus, which, again, giant eye. It even featured in Walking with Dinosaurs on their Cruel Sea episode. Ophthalmosaurus, though, could only reach maybe 12 feet or about 4 meters. Meanwhile, Agarvosaurus would have been much larger, reaching almost 6 meters or around 20 feet. A lot of the first ichthyosaurs were very large, including the new one, Ichthyotitan, that was named just a little while ago from when I'm recording this. That said, it's also really important to understand that most of those large ones died out during the early Jurassic, and then mostly during the Middle Jurassic, or basically the rest of the way during the Middle Jurassic, and then basically things that were Ophthalmosaurus size were left during the Late Jurassic and onwards. What this means is, yeah, that's definitely the case, but also some of those large ones were still able to be fairly successful. It's just that continual pressures led to their smaller size throughout large parts of the Mesozoic and especially the Jurassic. It also helps to suggest that they probably were living mostly in the shallow seas of Europe, and that's where this ophthalmosaur group actually evolved. And making a big jump towards things closer to the modern day, we also have some very interesting sites coming from South America that include both dinosaur footprint fossils and petroglyphs. And that doesn't mean they happened at the same time. The dinosaur fossils probably would have been around 100 million years old, and then the petroglyphs would have been painted only a few thousand years ago. That said, it does help to highlight that indigenous peoples saw fossils, saw they were important and unique, and were interacting with them. There were also attempts to use eDNA to see what animals would have been around in the Pleistocene of Siberia, and they did this using lake sediments from Siberia. Essentially, eDNA is just taking soil or water samples and seeing what DNA is in there. You're able to replicate DNA very well, and then you can break it into different strands and see what it is. And what they found is there were a number of different animals around, including things like cave bears and mammoths. That said, there were also a lot of the expected animals, like brown bears and also caribou. It's basically what you would expect from that environment today, just with a few extra add-ons, like mammoths. It's basically the same, just it's echoing what happened in the past. And now for how fossils can hopefully start bringing people together, we have the first described fossil pterosaur coming from North Korea. It's described as a rhamphorhynchoid, and the person describing it is actually a Mongolian researcher, so didn't have a ton of time to look at the specimen. That said, they were able to get photos, and that's what they're suggesting it is. I don't necessarily agree with this, because mostly it seems like the rhamphorhynchoids died out in the late Jurassic, and this fossil is actually from the early Cretaceous. The rocks it came from would have been very similar to the J-hole biota. So potentially instead of being a rhamphorhynchoid, it might be something more like J-holopterus, or one of the other pterosaurs from that environment. It's been rumored for a long time that there's great fossils in North Korea and people just haven't been able to see them because of the various political differences. Hopefully this will help to start normalize at least scientific relationships though, so you can really start understanding what's happening with those rocks. There was also a look at the idea of living fossils using cycads. And what they found is, yeah, no, there was a lot of diversity in the fossil record of cycads that does not relate to modern day cycads. Essentially, the idea that cycads, which aren't as numerous as they were in the fossil record, are living fossils is basically bunk. It's made up. Cycads are very, very unique plants today, sure, but they're not as diverse as they used to be. They are not that similar to what their fossils are like. This paper is essentially just saying, hey, living fossil is a really poor term. It doesn't accurately describe what happens evolutionarily. Even things that seem very similar to fossil forms, they still went through a ton of evolution. 66 million years of evolution in the case of anything that started to diversify after the dinosaurs, and many, many more hundreds of millions of years for anything beyond that. So there's a lot that's going on here that we need to understand. Not necessarily it's all just, oh, hey, look, this thing stayed the same for millions of years. They changed a lot. And finally, we have something that's just an article describing a ruling by the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which are essentially the people that say, yeah, this is when this period ends and this period starts. And they were doing that for modern day rocks to say, hey, is the Anthropocene valid? And because it's been so short, they went, yeah, no, it's not valid. Like, we don't have enough data to say it's valid. You would expect to see these rocks everywhere around the world. And well, sure, there's definitely some places where they are. It could also just be such a thin layer that's like, oh, hey, look, this is just a weird layer. Oh, okay, everything else is basically the same because we don't know the future yet. And it makes sense. Some people are upset about it, but it's kind of what was expected. The data just isn't there to say, hey, the Anthropocene is a real thing. It may be in the future, but not right now. And as for a paper I did an entire video on, we have Spinosaurus stuff. Basically, this paper was able to look at Spinosaurus in better detail and go, hey, there were some big air sacs along its vertebra, meaning it would have been fairly buoyant and probably not able to sink down into the water. And so it probably wasn't hunting underwater. Instead, it was probably standing at the edge of streams like a heron and occasionally diving in, but again, not getting very deep. And with that, it still would have been able to, especially with a long neck and strong legs, be able to reach out very quickly and catch fish, small crocodilians, or other animals that would have been around. Hey everyone, thanks for watching, really appreciate it. Currently working on a project on teeth, so you'll hear more about that in the future as I keep talking about it. Maybe if any of you show up at Society of Paleontology, you'll see me talk about some of that stuff. That said, I hope you guys are being inspired by all the science that's happening and seeing that there's a lot of research that people can do. With all that in mind, please check out our Patreon so you can help support the channel. Subscribe if you haven't, and be safe, take care, and don't go extinct.